Welcome to the Wise Fiduciary Podcast. I'm Marta Hurst. If you're a plan sponsor, committee member, advisor, or an executive responsible for a retirement plan, this show is for you. Season 5, we're doing something different. We're talking about the fiduciary red line, the moment where it feels like you're doing the right thing, but you're not. It's where industry standard stops being safe and where a routine decision quietly becomes exposure. So each episode, we take one decision point and examine it closely, not from a sales perspective or from a marketing perspective, but from a fiduciary one. Because most plan failures don't begin with bad intentions, they begin with comfort. So let's define the red line. I'm sure following the last episode, now all of you have established your governance culture, asking good questions and documenting decisions.
What, so there's homework now?
So now we need to tackle the mental shortcuts that trip up even well-meaning committees. So today we're going to talk about when does the industry standard become a lawsuit? So things like benchmarking without context, industry norms that quietly create liability, and how courts are actually evaluating prudence. I think one of the most dangerous phrases in the retirement plan governance is, this is industry standard. And I hear it a little more often than I would like in some of these meetings. Under ERISA, industry standard is not a defense. And in many cases, it's the beginning of a lawsuit. I do have some lawsuits to reference, but what we are talking about is not the edge cases or the outliers. These are really just ordinary, comfortable decisions, things that most plans are doing. And these courts, they don't grade on a curve. So you really need to know what you're doing and how to navigate some of these things to make sure that you don't get yourself into some hot water unintentionally and just by doing what everybody else is doing. The red line is crossed when fiduciaries substitute consensus for prudence. Industry norms and peer comparisons are not legal protection. Everyone does it is not a fiduciary defense. I often hear committee members ask, what do other plans do? And that question by itself is not necessarily bad. If you are considering things like employer contributions, and maybe you want to know what others in the industry are doing so that you are offering a competitive benefit, that seems good and reasonable to me. If you're asking that question as it relates to a fiduciary decision, that is not good and it is not defendable.
I'm not going to defend a thing.
Committees often assume that if they are using a service, it must be prudent. If providers are recommending something universal, then it must be safe. If peers are doing it, then regulators won't question it.
Just because she jumped off the cliff, you're going to jump off the cliff?
I feel like I see this a lot, and I'm kind of interested. I'm going to pick on the lifetime income annuities and retirement plans a little bit right now. It is new. And I know some people who are doing research on it and really trying to figure out where it fits and if it fits. But I do feel like once more plans start offering it, other plans will start to follow just because other plans are. And that happens with more things than just annuities. There are other fiduciary decisions that get made, and we'll talk about some today. But doing it just because everybody else is doing it, or like, well, those people must have already done their due diligence and it's probably good, so I'm going to do what they're doing, that is not defendable. So you need to know fiduciary standards are not based on popularity. They are based on prudence. I had a little bit of a hard time thinking about how to review all of this information in a podcast, because a lot of the things that we talk about seem to have overlapping issues, I'll say. When you dig into one thing, it's like, well, that could be this and it could be this. So I'm going to try and give a few straightforward examples, knowing that everything isn't straightforward and some of these things are tangled up together. Very rarely do you just see one part of these issues. One decision might be made that overlaps many parts of this. So let's talk about looking at investments and comparing funds to peer group averages. This is a very common industry standard. Almost every reporting software out there takes all of the investments for a particular peer group, and then they rate them against each other. And if you're better than the middle, then you get a green checkbox or a pass versus a fail. It's extremely common. A lot of advisor services, the things that they subscribe to reinforce that. And the committee feels like that is safe. They don't have access to their own reporting softwares. So it feels safe because it's measurable, right? They're giving you a report. Somebody did some math. It seems defensible in a meeting, and that is literally what everybody does. We see it 95% of the time. We work with a couple of offices that do investment reviews when they take the investment and they compare it to a low cost index fund in that peer group to determine if it's doing a good job or not. By and large, every report that you see is just going to be, here's all of the funds in that peer group. This one's better than 50%. It's what everybody's doing. This is the greatest example of industry standard. So where is the fiduciary failure? So peer groups are descriptive. They are not protective. They normalize mediocrity. They very often mask excessive fees. They ignore identical low-cost options. And 50% is not highest standards.
50%, I'll take it.
I don't know if you have children, if they've ever brought home a 50. That is not passing. That is not acceptable. For anything else, I'm not sure why it is when it comes to retirement plan investments. Better than 50% gives you a green mark. And I will say some advisors put additional scrutiny on their investments potentially. So there might be other factors that they consider, or maybe they don't look at the top 50, they look at the top 25. But by and large, the reports that you are seeing just mass produced, these softwares where you put in data and data gets spit out. That's what you're looking at, is the top 50%. So you need to understand what you are looking at. And I think that hopefully helps you determine, is that really a reasonable way for us to look at investments? That's certainly not a reasonable way when it comes to plans at Fiduciary Wise. So what have the courts said? In Tibble versus Edison, the Supreme Court made it very clear that ERISA is rooted in trust law, not in industry behavior. And Brotherston versus Putnam, the court rejected peer group defense when a lower cost index funds were available. So the fact that other plans were doing it is really irrelevant. Another example of kind of industry standard is we follow a good process. That should be enough. And I have heard this since I started in the industry. You just need a process. Just make sure you have a process. Build your process.
Just process?
Just the process isn't good enough. It has to be a prudent process. So the industry standard is, we had a meeting, we hired a consultant, we followed our process. And this is probably the most common defense that fiduciaries think it will save them, because I know I've heard it for 20 years. It feels safe because you did a documentation. You had a formal review. The fiduciary failure really happens because courts don't reward process theater. If the process avoids the hard questions, if you use padded benchmarks, there was a time in my career that they were difficult to identify. And I think about a particular company that many of our clients were using. And I noticed over time that their benchmark changed. What they were benchmarking their performance against changed. And their time period sometimes would also change. And I realize sometimes, people provide a lot of data, and their reasoning at the time for a benchmark change was, well, this benchmark better reflects what we are doing. It's a true benchmark. But was it, or was that benchmark used to make their performance and their strategy look better? If your process ignores costs, then you've got an issue there too. Why are you paying more for the same thing? And then if that's what your process looks like, you're avoiding hard questions, you're using padded or whatever benchmark someone else provided, you're ignoring the cost element of things, then that's going to fail. No matter how fancy your report looks, that is not a prudent process. There are a couple of court cases that talk about this as well. Cunningham versus Cornell. Process alone does not absolve fiduciaries if it does not lead to a prudent result. So you can have all the check boxes you want, but and I think this goes back to our first episode as well of asking questions and creating a culture where you talk through things to document. And then Tibble again, prudence is ongoing. It is not a one-time committee exercise. So knowing your benchmark, understanding the benchmark is all important to make sure that you are making the best decision for your plan, not doing the industry standard because everybody else said that was fine. I hear this one a lot, mostly from the industry, not as often plan sponsors, but I feel like sometimes plan sponsors don't make a change because this is kind of the mentality. All right, so let's talk about another fallacy in retirement plans. Higher fees are okay because performance was good. We hear this pretty often. I feel like there's, of course, a lot of reasons that there needs to be a little more digging under the hood. But the industry standard is, yeah, sure, it costs more, but performance has been strong. We hear this a lot. And even recently, I was at a conference where there was a money manager who got up to do a pitch about why their services were the best and how they were going to save participants more money and how participants were going to save more if they used them. All kinds of charts and things to show, to justify an additional cost. And we've done podcasts on money managers. So Isaac and I argued about it. We'll do another one this season where we talk about it. But I think that there's some stumbling blocks there. So it feels safe because short-term numbers can look good. I don't know any active or money manager who has always outperformed their benchmark. And so when people just look at particular time ranges, sure, that looks good. I also feel like it's gotten easier to explain. A lot of these, not just money managers, but actively managed funds, they have a lot of information about how they decide what to invest in their investment strategy. And it's a good story. And then it also confirms existing decisions. So if you've got an investment that's in the plan, I feel like this is where it comes into play the most often. It's not when you're looking at, okay, let's evaluate some other options. It's like, well, what do we have in there already? Well, let's just leave it. Like, yes, it's more expensive, but it's been doing pretty well. Well, that's not really a good enough reason to leave something in. Just because the performance is good, you still have to evaluate if those fees made sense. If the fees are higher, the performance doesn't just need to be good. It needs to be better than what you could have gotten otherwise. So the fiduciary failure, this is relying on behavioral bias, not about fiduciary judgment. The problems are, these short time horizons that you might be looking at. Who's presenting those? Who decided which time frames to look at? And are there holes there? And are there maybe some underperforming moments that are not being considered when you're looking at the plan as a whole? Also, you're essentially ignoring risk-adjusted returns when you're just looking at the return, and then potentially ignoring identical lower cost options. So we've seen plenty of lawsuits about that, about lower cost options being available to a plan, but they continue to be in the higher cost option. So you got to make sure that you know what options you have within the plan, and be able to justify really why are you making that decision or leaving an existing fund in there. If those expenses are higher, you need to be able to justify that. So from a court perspective, Fifth Third versus Dundenhofer.
Hal Sturt. Am I saying it right?
I don't know if I butchered that name or not because I just read them. I don't listen to them. So cost alone, it isn't dispositive, but cost plus risk plus performance absolutely is. We've also seen courts recognize gambler's fallacy and sample size neglect, and that does not excuse fiduciaries for them. Foreman versus Tri-Health, offering a more expensive version of an identical investment is indefensible. I mean, that seems pretty obvious.
Way to state the obvious.
If you've got an option to be in a lower cost fund, that should be a no-brainer. Good short-term performance does not erase long-term fiduciary responsibility. All right, this one is a little bit of a touchy subject. We hired experts, so responsibility was delegated. Now, Fiduciary Wise is an expert where responsibility gets delegated. The industry standard now, and I think there's a couple of different ways to look at this. Not a lot of plans actually have a 402A fiduciary, but a lot of plans have advisors or consultants that are providing guidance when it comes to investments or even other things within the plan. So the industry standard is, well, I hired somebody. And frankly, I hear this story when I talk about Fiduciary Wise and our services as a 402A fiduciary. Sometimes from plan sponsors, I hear, well, I already have a fiduciary, to which my response is, oh, what is your other fiduciary? And they say something like, oh, we have a 338 fiduciary. Well, that's great. A 338 fiduciary is responsible for the investments in your plan, not responsible for legal and management, not responsible for administration. So one, know who you hired and what you are actually hiring away or delegating. But the industry standard is hiring a consultant equals protection. So that really fails because delegation does not eliminate liability. And I feel like years ago, plan sponsors really wanted a way to totally get out of any liability. And I hope by now everybody realizes there's really no way for you to completely eliminate it. You're still going to be left with some of that. And part of that is your duty to monitor. So even if you hire an investment 338, for example, you still have a duty to monitor them. Monitoring is non-delegable. You can't delegate your monitoring responsibility. So making sure that you don't just rely on the fact that, well, I hired somebody and they are supposed to be taking care of that. Even those employers who hire Fiduciary Wise, we expect them to monitor us as well. And we have some tools and ways that we show them that we are taking care of the plan as we said we would. But everybody should have, everybody has a responsibility to be doing the right thing for the plan when they are a fiduciary to the plan. But as a plan sponsor, those of you who are plan sponsors, you have a duty to continue to monitor even when you've hired it out. I think about when you hire a contractor to do some work on your home, you don't just say, okay, hope everything goes great and leave the country for 6 months. You check in and make sure everybody did what they were supposed to do. And are we meeting our timeline? You don't just blindly follow. So the same concept applies in retirement plans. Certainly, I would rather hire a plumber than do it myself, but you don't just hope that they did it right and never question anything that happens. If they leave and there's 4 pipes on the floor, it leads you to some questions like, hey, what's going on here? What did you do? What didn't you do? So the same kind of logic applies to retirement plans. You're still responsible for monitoring those that you have delegated to. Also, I want to point out that following advice is not the same as exercising judgment. As a plan sponsor myself, there's a lot of advice that gets passed around out there for the best ways to do things. But ultimately, you are exercising judgment when you're making decisions when it comes to the retirement plan. So make sure that you're not just doing what you're doing because everybody else is. I am providing some homework.
Sure you want to do this?
Or maybe just questions to think about as you think about your plan. So ask yourself, have we verified the data behind what we think is standard? Are we aligned with norms or best practices? cheat sheet. The answer should be best practices. So if it's not, then there is some work to be done there. Would we stand by this decision if there were no peer comparisons at all? So if you don't have other plans to consider or these industry standards, would you have come to those same decisions, or do those need to be reevaluated? If today's episode raised questions about your plan, then I did my job. That is the point.
I did it!
So fiduciary responsibility is not about checking boxes. It's about understanding where the red line actually is. If you would like to continue conversation, and I hope that you do, please follow us on social media for ongoing insights and commentary. And if you need clarity about your own plan decisions, schedule time with our team at fiduciarywise.com/scheduling. And until next time, stay thoughtful, stay disciplined, and know where your red line is.